Thomas Holloway, Amelia Rowan, Mark Jensen, Daniel Royce, Nathaniel Collins, Eli Turner, Joshua Martin, Clara Grayson, and Adrian Whitlock. 9 names that once belonged to ordinary families, but each now echoes through some of the darkest crimes imaginable. These were not strangers on the street or shadowy figures hiding in alleys. They were fathers, daughters, sons, and trusted pillars of their communities. Behind their smiles and reputations lay secrets of greed, resentment, paranoia, and obsession that ended in unthinkable acts. What begins as love and loyalty twists into betrayal and massacre, leaving investigators stunned and entire towns haunted. These are the stories of families destroyed not by outsiders, but by the very people they trusted most. Thomas Holloway was the kind of man who gave the impression of stability and calm. To his neighbors in Ohio, he was a successful banker, a devoted husband, and a proud father of 3 children. People often described him as polite, generous, and reliable. But behind the polished smile and professional appearance, his life was rotting from the inside. For years, Thomas had been living beyond his means, covering up financial mistakes with lies and elaborate schemes. He borrowed money from the very clients who trusted him most, moving funds from one account to another until the numbers no longer made sense even to him. By the winter of 1998, rumors of fraud had begun to surface, and Thomas knew it was only a matter of time before everything collapsed. Exposure would mean prison, disgrace, and the loss of everything he had built his identity on. Rather than face humiliation, Thomas devised a plan that investigators would later call one of the most calculated and chilling family massacres in Ohio's history. On a quiet, snow-covered night, he waited until his wife and children were asleep before carrying out the unthinkable. When the house fell silent, Thomas turned the weapon on himself, leaving behind no survivors. At first, those who knew him clung to the idea that despair had driven him to a sudden act, but the evidence told a more disturbing story. Hidden in a locked drawer of his office were stacks of ledgers filled with false numbers, altered signatures, and proof of years of systematic fraud. Every page was a record of deception, each entry showing how carefully he maintained his illusion of success. The massacre was not a moment of madness, but the final step in a life built on lies. Amelia Rowan had always been the quiet one, the daughter who never raised her voice, the sister who rarely argued, and the person in her family who seemed to simply blend into the background. In rural Kentucky, her life appeared simple. A modest home shared with her elderly parents and younger brother, daily routines that never changed, and neighbors who barely noticed her presence. But silence can hold dangerous weight. Amelia's diary, discovered later in the investigation, revealed a much darker picture of her inner world. For years, she described herself as invisible, a ghost in her own home, ignored and overlooked by the very people who should have cared for her most. Bitterness grew inside her like a slow poison, twisting her view of her family until they became symbols of everything she felt she had been denied: attention, love, and recognition. In the summer of 2005, Amelia's resentment reached its breaking point. One evening, while the house was still and the night was warm, she made her move. When neighbors saw the Rowan home dark the next morning, no one suspected anything unusual. The family often kept to themselves. But when days passed without a sound, local police entered and uncovered a scene that shocked even seasoned investigators. All 4 family members had been killed in their sleep, their lives taken swiftly and silently. At first glance, the house appeared to have been broken into, windows cracked, belongings overturned, as though strangers had forced their way inside. Yet the staging was sloppy, and soon contradictions began to emerge. The crucial piece of evidence came when investigators dusted the weapon hidden beneath the floorboards. Amelia's fingerprints were all over it. The girl who had lived unseen for so long had made herself visible in the most horrific way imaginable. Her attempt to frame strangers failed, leaving her exposed as the architect of her family's end. The town that once overlooked her would never forget her name again. Mark Jensen was the picture of success, the kind of man who inspired admiration from friends, neighbors, and colleagues alike. He owned a small but thriving business, drove a new car every few years, and lived in a home that radiated comfort and stability. To the outside world, He was a loyal husband and the doting father of 2 young daughters, the man who seemed to have life figured out. But behind the polished surface, Mark's ambition had taken a darker turn. To feed his appetite for wealth and status, he began embezzling money from his own company. At first, the thefts were small, easy to hide, but greed is never satisfied. Soon, his books were riddled with discrepancies, and the risk of exposure grew with every dollar he stole. By the fall of 2010, Mark felt cornered. His wife had begun asking questions about unusual financial moves, and whispers around the office hinted at suspicions. To Mark, the fear of being exposed, losing his reputation, and facing prison was unbearable. Instead of confessing, he chose to silence the people closest to him. During a family gathering, when his wife and daughters were enjoying drinks he had prepared, Mark slipped antifreeze into their glasses. The poison worked slowly, leaving his loved ones in agony while he remained eerily calm. By the next morning, the Jensen household was silent. Mark even joined the search for answers, playing the part of the devastated husband and father. He wept with relatives, spoke to police, and pretended to be just another victim of tragedy. But the mask slipped when investigators obtained security footage from a local store. There he was, weeks before the murders, smiling at the cashier while buying antifreeze. That image, his calm face in a moment of casual betrayal, was the final proof of his guilt. The successful man everyone admired was nothing more than a murderer who poisoned his own family to protect his lies. Daniel Royce returned from war with medals pinned to his chest and a smile that hid what no one wanted to see. To neighbors and friends, he was a decorated veteran, a man who had served his country with honor. But inside his own home in 2013, the reality was far different. Daniel carried invisible wounds, the kind of scars no metal could heal. His nights were filled with restless pacing, muttered conversations with shadows, and a paranoia that grew sharper with every passing week. He believed strangers were watching him, that hidden forces were manipulating his life, and worst of all, that his own family had become part of the threat. The Royce household, once filled with laughter from 2 young children and the warmth of his wife's patience, soon became a place of fear. Daniel began locking the doors not just at night but during the day, drawing curtains even when the sun was out. He scribbled notes on scraps of paper, leaving them scattered across the house. Warnings about unseen enemies and cryptic statements that made little sense to anyone but him. His wife tried to get him help, but Daniel refused, convinced doctors would only drug him into silence. One stormy night, paranoia tipped into catastrophe. With rain hammering against the windows and thunder shaking the walls, Daniel acted on his delusions. He took the lives of his wife, his children, and even the family dog, convinced he was saving them from a fate worse than death. When police forced their way inside, the scene was more horrifying than they could have imagined. Scrawled across the walls in thick black marker were frantic messages. They were already gone. I had to free them, and the Watchers won't win. For investigators, it was one of the most chilling cases they had ever seen. A family destroyed not by hatred, but by the unchecked torment of a mind consumed by paranoia. Nathaniel Collins was a man who lived behind gates and chandeliers, the proud owner of an estate that symbolized wealth and refinement. To his community, he was a generous host, the kind of figure who welcomed guests to elegant charity dinners and gave speeches about success. His family, his wife and 2 teenage children, appeared equally polished, often seen smiling in photographs from grand events on their sprawling property. But beneath the surface of elegance, Nathaniel's empire was crumbling. Years of risky investments had gone sour, debts piled up quietly, and the image of power he presented to the world was nothing more than a fragile illusion. The fear of exposure gnawed at him, for a man who built his identity on wealth could not bear the humiliation of losing it all. In the spring of 2016, Nathaniel orchestrated what looked like one final act of grace. He invited his family to a lavish dinner in their mansion's dining hall. Candles flickered across the long table, wine glasses sparkled in the light, and everyone dressed in formal attire as though celebrating something important. But the feast was not a celebration, it was a farewell. Nathaniel had laced the wine with a deadly poison, ensuring that each sip carried them closer to silence. By the end of the evening, his family sat lifeless in their chairs, dressed in elegance but frozen in tragedy. Nathaniel himself was later found in the same room, collapsed at the head of the table, having taken the same poisoned drink. When investigators arrived, the scene was eerie, almost theatrical. It looked as though the Collins family had been captured mid-banquet, a portrait of luxury that hid unimaginable horror. To the world, Nathaniel's name became a symbol of greed's darkest edge, a man who chose death over disgrace, taking the people he loved with him to preserve an image that had already shattered. Eli Turner was the kind of man small towns are built around, steady, hardworking, and devoted to his role as a father and husband. In Colorado, people trusted him with their cars at his modest mechanic shop, and he never turned away a neighbor in need. On the surface, his life was ordinary, even admirable, but his marriage had been deteriorating for years. By 2018, the tension in his home was impossible to hide. His wife had filed for divorce, a move that shattered Eli's pride. To him, the idea of his family breaking apart was more than a personal failure. It was an attack on his identity, his control, and the image of himself he wanted the world to believe. Instead of facing the pain of separation, Eli made a decision that would forever stain his name. One evening, in the quiet of his suburban home, he took the lives of his wife and children in a methodical and brutal act. The silence afterward was chilling, the kind of silence that only comes when laughter and life are stolen. But what disturbed investigators most wasn't just the act itself. It was what Eli did next. He cleaned the house carefully, erasing the chaos he had created, and then walked out the door to go to work as though nothing had happened. At the shop the next day, coworkers recalled Eli laughing about sports, sharing coffee, and talking about routine repairs with his usual calm demeanor. No one could have guessed that while he joked and worked on cars, his family lay lifeless in their home. When police finally uncovered the crime, the duality of Eli's behavior became the darkest detail of the case. He had not acted out of sudden rage, but with cold calculation, slipping seamlessly back into his daily life as though murder was just another task on his list. The Martin family lived deep in the forests of Oregon, far from city life and the eyes of outsiders. They were survivalists, proud of their independence and suspicious of the modern world. Their log cabin was surrounded by thick trees, stocked with food supplies, and cut off from most neighbors. To acquaintances in town, they were simply private people who valued self-reliance. But for Joshua Martin, the 17-year-old son of the household, the isolation was suffocating. He watched his friends in town go to parties, use cell phones, and make plans for futures he knew he could never have. His parents enforced strict rules, controlling every detail of his life, and he began to see their cabin not as a home but as a cage. By 2019, Joshua's resentment had hardened into something far darker. He started planning in secret, studying the routines of his parents and younger sister, writing down times when the house was most quiet. He collected tools and kept notes hidden beneath his mattress. What no one realized was that the boy who appeared obedient and quiet was preparing to destroy the only world he had ever known. When distant relatives grew concerned after months of silence from the family, they made the journey to the remote property. What they found inside the cabin was a scene of devastation. The Martin family had been wiped out with precision, their lives taken in the very place they thought was safest. Investigators were puzzled at first. There were no signs of forced entry, no strangers caught on surrounding trails, and no evidence of outsiders. The truth emerged when Joshua's journals were discovered. Page after page detailed his plan, his hatred of the isolation, and his dream of freedom at any cost. In the end, it wasn't intruders who ended the Martin family. It was the son they had tried so hard to control. In 2020, the Grayson family home in suburban Texas was reduced to ashes in a fire so fierce that firefighters could do little more than contain the blaze. When the flames died down and investigators entered the ruins, the discovery was far worse than anyone expected. Inside the charred remains were the bodies of 5 family members, parents and 3 children, huddled in what looked like their final moments. At first, the tragedy was believed to be an accident, the kind of terrible misfortune that sometimes strikes without warning. Neighbors gathered around their grieving eldest daughter, Clara, who had stood outside weeping as the fire consumed everything she had ever known. She clung to them for comfort, crying out as though she too had lost everything in the flames. But the fire investigators were not convinced. Something about the blaze didn't match the pattern of a natural accident. The accelerant traces found near the bedrooms suggested deliberate intent. As they sifted through the wreckage, suspicion shifted toward the very person who had survived the tragedy. Clara Grayson, a college student, had secrets of her own. She had been expelled months earlier but hid the truth from her parents. When they discovered the deception and cut her off financially, her resentment festered into rage. Rather than face the shame of her double life, Clara set fire to the home while her family slept. The most chilling detail was the way she carried herself during the disaster. Clara screamed, cried, and clutched her neighbor's arms while pretending to be powerless against the blaze she had started herself. Her performance fooled nearly everyone, until the forensic evidence uncovered her role. What had first seemed like a cruel accident became a calculated act of revenge, carried out by the one person her family trusted most. The Whitlocks were a family admired in their small New Hampshire town. They owned a peaceful organic farm, selling fresh produce at local markets, and seemed to embody everything wholesome about rural life. Photographs showed them smiling together at community fairs, their modest farmhouse framed by golden fields. But in 2022, that image of perfection was shattered in the most disturbing way. Their teenage son, Adrian, had always been quiet, often spending hours alone in his room. Teachers described him as intelligent but withdrawn, while classmates recalled his fascination with violent history and unsettling artwork. Hidden from his parents' view, Adrian was keeping journals filled with disturbing notes, sketches, and references to infamous killers. He wasn't just fascinated, he was studying them. One crisp autumn evening, while the family gathered inside their home, Adrian acted on the obsession he had been nurturing for years. Methodical and cold, he took the lives of his parents and siblings, leaving behind a scene so calculated that investigators later described it as a blueprint of violence. Unlike other cases, there were no attempts to flee or cover his tracks. Instead, Adrian sat in the kitchen, waiting. When authorities arrived after a concerned neighbor reported strange silence at the farm, they found him calm, almost detached, as though he had completed something long planned. The evidence in his room was even more chilling. Lined notebooks revealed that Adrian had studied past family massacre cases in obsessive detail. Names like Thomas Holloway, Amelia Rowan, and Mark Jensen were scribbled in the margins, their crimes dissected and analyzed as though they were lessons. He wrote about wanting to join them, to carve his own place into the dark history of family tragedies. The Whitlock case became infamous not only for its brutality but because it proved how obsession with violence can grow into a legacy of horror. Adrian had turned himself into the Finn,